One of Canada's greatest enemies is a Canadian himself, and he could be coming home very soon. I'm Jacqui Delaney. Tonight, the true story of convicted terrorist Omar Khadr, the enemy within. How would you feel if you were at dinner one evening and looked up to see this man seated at the table next to yours? How would you feel if he were ahead of you in the checkout line at the local hardware store? What if he were sitting next to you on a cross-country flight? This is Omar Khadr. The 25-year-old has been convicted of murdering United States Army medic Christopher Speer. And 2 years ago, an American military jury handed Khadr a 40-year sentence for his crime.
There's evidence that he was making bombs. There's evidence that he was emplacing bombs.
But very soon, Khadr could be back in Canada. He could be free to walk the streets of your city, your town, or your neighborhood.
He's a murderer, and he is convicted by the strength of his own word.
In his October 2010 confession, Khadr admitted details about the events surrounding Sergeant Speer's death, including his guilt. It happened in 2002 during a fierce firefight with U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan. Khadr was 15 years old at the time. And American troops actually gave him a chance to leave the area safely with the other children and women who were also there. Instead, Khadr decided to stay back and fight. He was eventually wounded in the battle. Holed up inside a building and badly injured, Khadr says he knew the battle was over. But when U.S. soldiers came looking for him, that's when the young terrorist says he lobbed a well-timed grenade in their direction. The explosion wounded 2 men, Sergeant Speer and Sergeant Lane Morris. When Khadr was finally captured, troops say Khadr glared at them. In plain English, he swore and dared the soldiers to pull their triggers. Instead, they treated Khadr for his wounds and transported him to a nearby airbase where he was nursed back to health with expert medical care.
He's lucky because he killed one medic. The second medic saved his life.
Sergeant Morris lost an eye. Sergeant Speer, husband and father of 2, died. Khadr was eventually transferred to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, America's detainment camp for captured al-Qaeda terrorists. 8 years later, Omar's military trial finally started.
A trial for the youngest detainee and the only Western detainee held at Gitmo.
Khadr would make a plea deal with the U.S. government, one that was backed by Ottawa. He confessed to throwing the grenade that killed Sergeant Speer and wounded Sergeant Morris. In return, and despite a jury recommendation of a 40-year prison sentence, Khadr was handed just 8 years. Included in that plea bargain was the stipulation that Omar Khadr could apply for a prisoner transfer to Canada after serving just 1 year in U.S. custody. Last October, Khadr became eligible for that transfer, and his paperwork to return to Canada has been filed. Any day now, you could be at a restaurant eating dinner with your family, and he could be at a nearby table. Or you could bump into him at your hardware or neighborhood grocery. But not if my guest has anything to say about it. Ezra Levant is the author of the new book, The Enemy Within: Terror, Lies, and the Whitewashing of Omar Khadr. He joins me next. There is much we know about Omar Khadr and the years after his capture in Afghanistan a decade ago. When you dig through the liberal spin, the truth is actually pretty clear. But to understand why the young Khadr developed into a killer for al-Qaeda, you need to know where he came from and what his life was like growing up. Ezra Levant is the author of the new book, The Enemy Within, Terror Lies, and the Whitewashing of Omar Khadr. And he is also the host of The Source right here on the Sun News Network. So, Ezra, I want to break down the Khadr case with you, and I want to start with the parents, neither one of which is a fan of Canada or ever has been, despite all the wonderful things this country has given to them. Talk to me about his parents as well as Omar's early days here in Canada, because he did spend some time here in Canada.
Sure. Khadr's parents came here in 1977. Ahmed, father, his dad came from Egypt. His mom, Maha, came from the Palestinian territories. And they were off to a great start. I mean, he got a degree in computer engineering from University of Ottawa. He got hired with Bell. I mean, he was on a great track. He was being subsidized by the Canadian government for his education, great health care for the kids, including one with a heart murmur. So Canada was treating this new immigrant family great. But instead of following that peaceful path, Ahmed Khadr decided that he was going to get into the terrorism business. And he started going from mosque to mosque in Canada, raising money for a fake charity called Human Concern International, and pouring out those dollars in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Osama bin Laden himself praised Papa Khadr for being his bagman.
You say Osama bin Laden. I wanted to ask you about not only Osama bin Laden, but also his second-in-command, al-Zawahiri. The father, Khadr, Ahmed, actually came to know both of these men.
That's right. And remember, this was before Osama bin Laden was the public enemy #1. This was 15
Early
years.
Days
Yeah, this was 15 years before 9/11. So Osama bin Laden wasn't the. I mean, he was a very sophisticated man. He had an international network, but he wasn't the world's most wanted man. At that point in time, Omar Khadr I mean, he was just born in the 80s, but very soon the family had a habit of taking the kids to Pakistan and Afghanistan, and not for family vacations, but for training, not Boy Scouts, but seriously, Omar Khadr, young Omar at the time, was trained in explosives, in espionage, in poisons. I mean, he was given a sophisticated training. He grew up in a crime family. It was like a mafia, but instead of being just about money and drugs, they were about terrorism and jihad.
You mentioned mafia and being like a crime family. They're also referred to as Canada's first family of terror because, as you said, the kids went through training, weaponry, bomb making, poisons, the like. But they did come back to Canada, as you mentioned, typically when somebody in the family needed medical care, including at one point the father, Ahmed, I believe, had an arm injury. That they saved his arm, I believe, at Sunnybrook Hospital in Toronto.
You know, they look at Canada as a citizenship of convenience. They love the freebies, love the free health care. I mentioned the heart murmur. When one of Omar Khadr's brothers got shot up in Pakistan, where did they go for health care? Did they go to Pakistan? They came to Canada for free surgery. They look at us as a bunch of dupes because we keep bailing them out, not just health care wise, but we actually have saved the Khadrs from jail in the past. And ironically, I mentioned when Omar Khadr's dad did the fundraising circuit for terrorism, the Toronto Star back then was so impressed with his Ahmed Khadr, they were writing about it as if it was a real charity. There's so many echoes here, Jackie, from the 70s and the 80s when Omar Khadr's father, the terrorist fundraiser, was treated as this multicultural hero by the Star. Same things happening now. Omar Khadr, the confessed murderer, terrorist, spy, Jew hater, jihadist. Again, the Star, the CBC are turning him into this little lamb who didn't do anything wrong. Again, this family is duping us.
It wasn't just the media at the time. Even the government, the federal government at the time, Jean Chrétien, went to visit. There's the famous story about Jean Chrétien visiting Ahmed. As I'm to understand it, Ezra, he was in custody for his involvement with the Egyptian embassy bombing, along with his, at that time, soon-to-be son-in-law. Was in Pakistani custody. Tell us about that, about Prime Minister Chrétien going to visit him.
Sure. I mean, Ahmed Khadr, the fundraiser, he was on the radar screen of a lot of intelligence agencies, the Chinese, the Americans.
Well, even the Canadian. By this point, the Canadians were even like, they had stopped funding this charity.
They stripped it of his charitable status. And he was arrested in Pakistan. They have a tremendous terrorism problem there. It's rife. So he was in prison. But Chrétien went to Pakistan on one of his trade missions, and he was in a hotel. And Omar Khadr's mom, Maha, with the kids, came and sort of swarmed the prime minister with the media cameras in tow and said, "Oh, please, you must get my husband out, please." And Jean Chrétien intervened with Pakistan's government and said, "Can you let this guy go? He's our citizen." And so this mastermind terrorist, Ahmed Khadr, Omar Khadr's dad, who was captured, was in jail, the Canadian government sprung him, Jean Chrétien. And I say again, the past is prologue. Here we go again. It's almost 20 years later, and we're being asked to spring Omar Khadr, the murderer, just like we sprung his dad from a Pakistani jail.
Also, it must be said that his father was killed in a firefight with Pakistani security forces years later.
Yeah, it's terrorism is the family business, and Omar Khadr's brother was brought home here for medical care
because he was injured in that same firefight, correct, and paralyzed.
And to this day, his family back home, his sister Zainab, Omar Khadr's sister, she talks about supporting Omar in his terrorism. They're completely unrepentant. His remaining family, the ones that haven't been shot in battle, are so proud of his terrorism. I mean, they boast about it through their niqabs and burqas. They boast about it. He's a little prince to them. He's going to take over the family business.
Isn't that just charming? Canada's first family of terrorism is the best way to put it, and he is the prodigal son, just, about to come home if we let them have their way. Ezra, we have so much more to talk about. Omar Khadr was 15 years old when he killed a U.S. Army medic. So, was he a child soldier, as the mainstream media want you to believe, or is he, like his father, a terrorist? We'll answer that for you next. There is no disputing the fact that Omar Khadr was only 15 years old when he threw a grenade that killed Army medic and father of 2 young children, Christopher Spear. And nobody argues the fact that Khadr was engaged in the firefight with U.S. soldiers that day. However, that's where opinions begin to diverge. Ezra Levant joins me once again now. And Ezra, you're one of the few in the Canadian media who says that Omar Khadr was an enthusiastic terrorist, hell-bent on killing not just one American infidel, but as many American soldiers as possible that day and days beyond. Most others hold him up as a child soldier, this young, naive dolt, really, is the way that some people would have you believe he was. He was 15, as I just said. We can't argue that. But was he a child soldier?
He was a few weeks shy of his 16th birthday, and we know how we treat people just a few weeks shy of 16 when they murder in Canada. We put them in trial. We put them in jail. Quite often we move them to adult court, because when you're on the cusp of 16, it's a lot different than if you're 10 or 11. And 10 or 11 is the typical age of what we call child soldiers. Typically they're in a place like Rwanda. They're kidnapped from their families. They're often hopped up on drugs to get them ready to fight. They're forced to go into battle. I mean, they're truly children. That was not the case with Omar Khadr. He was enthusiastic. This was his life's dream. He, in fact, killing this American soldier, he later told prison guards, was the best moment of his life. In fact, when he was down in the dumps in prison, he would replay the murder in his mind to feel great. In fact, amazingly, when he was captured by American troops, he just killed this Army medic, Christopher Spear. What was the first thing he said to these soldiers? He said, "F you, Americans, shoot me now." Why? Because he wanted to go to heaven to get his 72 virgins. But the thing is, even once he was captured, he's been in prison for 10 years in Guantanamo Bay, his ardor, his enthusiasm for jihad has not gone softer. It's gone stronger. He's completely unremorseful. In fact, he thinks of his dad as a hero. And in terms of his own religiosity, he's become more of a fanatic. He's memorized the whole Quran. He leads the religious ceremonies on Guantanamo Bay. Even though he's the youngest guy there, all the other terrorists look up to him because he actually murdered an American soldier. And as we talked about, his family is so pro-terrorist. You've got 3 big warning lights. Unrepentant, more fanatical than ever, and his family is egging him on. This guy is a powder keg, and it was no childish indiscretion. This is his life's mission. He's not crazy. He's passionate about the jihad. He's a walking danger, so much so, Jackie, his own lawyer, Dennis Edney, twice says, this guy's got to be de-radicalized. When your own lawyer is afraid of you, I'm going to be afraid too.
So many in the liberal media and the mainstream media are very hung up on the legal definition of child soldier, which has, by the way, changed in the past decade or so. There have been some changes depending on what source you're looking at. However, as you mentioned, I mean, we can talk about here in Canada and as well as in the U.S., because this is a U.S. military trial that he was involved in. You can be tried as an adult at the age of 15. It depends on the seriousness of her crime. You bring that up. But also talk to me about the difference. You bring up Rwanda, Sierra Leone. Talk to me about the difference. You know, post-traumatic stress disorder. You know, as you said, there's been no repentance on his part. There's no genuine remorse for
no remorse
what
at
he
all.
did.
Yeah, I mean, a real child soldier is the most traumatic thing in their life. They're kidnapped, they're thrust into violence. Omar Khadr actually had no traumatic stress afterwards. That was the best day of his life. I mean, think about the best day of your life. Was it graduating from school, a first kiss? I don't know. For Omar Khadr, it was murdering an American. And we have international law that governs what a child soldier is and isn't. The UN Treaty on the Rights of the Child says it's 14 or less, and Khadr was 15, almost 16. So, I mean, there is no legal doubt here. I mean, should we prosecute or not? There is some prosecutorial discretion. But in the case of Khadr, you've got a die-hard murderer. By the way, he wasn't under duress when he committed these crimes. His father wasn't there. His father was long dead. I mean, he chose to commit this. He chose to commit this murder, and in fact, the U.S. Soldiers there basically broadcast, if anyone wants to leave now, any women or children or young people want to leave, and many did. Omar Khadr stayed in that little fort because he wanted to murder.
There are so many in the media, the consensus media, as we like to call it, that we could focus on. One person in particular that I want to focus on, who's an activist even, is Romeo Dallaire. Even Romeo Dallaire has weighed in on this. And, you know, in many ways, my heart goes out to Romeo Dallaire, as I'm sure yours does as well. And he certainly has a different perspective on child soldiers. But does he have this wrong?
He does. Sorry, I mentioned Khadr's dad was dead. Khadr's dad died in 2003, sorry, not 2002. As to Romeo Dallaire, he saw true child soldiers in Africa, the true 10, 11, 12-year-olds being ripped away from families and forced to murder. But that was not what happened in Afghanistan. I'm sure if Romeo Dallaire served in Afghanistan, he would have seen a totally different thing. Terrorists volunteering from around the world to go and murder. That's the thing about Omar Khadr. He didn't grow up in Afghanistan. He grew up in Scarborough. His dad took him there, and Omar Khadr volunteered to be there. This was his life's delight. He wanted to grow up and be like Dad, an al-Qaeda henchman. And to this day, and he's had 10 years to reconsider things in Guantanamo Bay, Jackie. He has not. In fact, he is
exposed to Western culture, books, entertainment, everything yet again.
The U.S. Army has recruited Muslim chaplains, imams, to try and teach these terrorists that there is a way to be Muslim without being a terrorist. Omar Khadr refuses to even talk to the U.S. Army Muslim imam. He refuses to talk to moderate Muslims. He is even more dedicated. So even if the excuse held water 10 years ago and it didn't, what do you say today? I mean, he's a 25-year-old man today who loves murdering infidels and might well do it again.
I do want to talk more about what you call the media whitewashing of the Khadr family, specifically this case surrounding Omar. One person who has continuously been in his corner is Ryerson University professor Judy Rebick. Now, for anyone not familiar with Rebick or her support for Omar Khadr, here's a brief example. Just after the news broke in July of 2010 that Omar had fired his lawyers, Rebick wrote an article expressing her grief and sadness for his situation. She says Khadr fired his lawyers not so much to delay the process as to shine a light on the injustices heaped upon him. But Rebick doesn't stop there. Check out what she says next. His action reminds me of the heroine of the novel The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, who is massively and brutally abused by every level of the system, only to emerge so strong and skillful she is practically a superhero. Ezra?
Oh my God. She's obviously got a sort of a jailhouse crush on this guy. She even said something nuttier. She compared Omar Khadr, confessed terrorist, murderer, poisoner, anti-Semite jihadist. She compared him, Jackie, you're not going to believe this, to Nelson Mandela. Judy Rebick compared this little terrorist to Nelson Mandela, the liberator of South Africa.
In what vein?
Just his dignity and his heroism. But here's the crazy irony. Judy Rebick is a feminist. She's a woman who doesn't wear a burqa. She's actually Jewish. She's very pro-sexual freedom, you know, abortion on demand, gay rights. All the things that Omar Khadr despises. She would be first on the list of people Khadr would kill. But she has thrown herself to his cause. Why? I believe that's the real story here. It's not Omar Khadr the terrorist, it's a fascinating story, but how the rest of the establishment, journalists, so-called reporters who become press agents for Khadr, the Canadian Bar Association, so many people who should know better, politicians like Romeo Dallaire, have actually tried to whitewash Omar Khadr and make him into this little lamb instead of the Paul Bernardo-style murderer he is. Isn't it strange that a liberal Jewish activist progressive like Judy Rebick would turn this murderer into a hero?
Well, as you mentioned, there's so many. We could sit here all day long and just go through the list. You know, you have Michelle Shepard from the Toronto Star, who also wrote a book. There's a university professor in Alberta who wants to give him a scholarship as if somehow Omar Khadr is coming back to Canada to
this
go
professor
to university.
Engaged in a pen pal relationship with dear Omar. And you know, other reporters said that the real war criminals here are the Americans. They called it a kangaroo court, even though the U.S. Supreme Court has approved with some revisions the trial process there. I mean, America is one of the strongest countries in terms of rule of law, and Guantanamo Bay, you may have heard just last week, they put in a new $750,000 soccer stadium. I mean, they played Sony PlayStation there, they got the big screen TV, sports
Special
all day.
diets.
Oh yeah, Omar Khadr, he says, I want Reeboks, not Nikes, and I want Parmesan cheese on the side, and I want a special spice from Saudi Arabia. I'm not making any of these anecdotes out. He runs the prison. I mean, he has the guards doing his errands. I mean, it's just.
I hear he's pretty buff as well.
Well, yeah. I mean, the picture his mom circulated to the press, that little lamb from junior high, that's not actually what he looked like when he was captured. I mean, there is some Al Qaeda home movies of Omar Khadr building IEDs, those explosive devices. You don't see those a lot at the CBC because that breaks the narrative of Omar Khadr being this little lamb. But actually, he's a 6 foot something. He's ripped. He can do 100 curls. Like, he spends his day doing two things: working out and studying the Quran, and rejecting any attempts to liberalize him. That man is a powder keg. Don't take it from me. Don't take it from the prosecution. Take it from his own lawyer, Dennis Edney.
Very quickly before we take another break here, I do want you to weigh in on Michelle Shepard because, as I said, from the Toronto Star has written her own book.
Oh, she's the expert on Khadr, but she calls him a victim.
Tell me about, though, her, because from what I understand, she's quite cozy with the Khadr camp.
Oh, yeah.
Entirely.
I mean, now, she hasn't met Omar Khadr himself. No reporters get to visit the prisoner in Guantanamo Bay. But she's hung out at great length with the family, and Maha and Zainab, and gotten to know their stories. And she has become sort of a Stockholm Syndrome captive. She's on their side. And you know what? Omar Khadr is smarter than I mean, listen, his dad, Ahmed, was a computer engineer, brains run in the family. Omar Khadr treats media like pawns on a chessboard. He regards the Toronto Star and the CBC as Al-Qaeda assets. Because remember, the war isn't just fought with bullets. It's fought with propaganda. I mean, remember in World War II, Axis Sally and Tokyo Rose? Well, Omar Khadr is playing this orchestra of journalists just beautifully. And if he gets out, God forbid, he may commit violent murder. But even if he doesn't, he will be a walking, talking ad for Al-Qaeda. You can murder a U.S. soldier and still walk around with impunity and strut your stuff and probably sue and become a millionaire out of it.
He wouldn't be the first to sue the federal government and walk away with millions of dollars,
yeah, you're
tens
right.
of millions of dollars. All right, we've been talking a lot about Omar Khadr, the early years, but who is Omar Khadr today? After 10 years at Guantanamo Bay, who is the man Omar Khadr has become? Dr. Michael Wellner joins me with his expert opinion next. Much has been made in the media about Omar Khadr's age at the time of his crime. However, he is now a man of 25 years, and he has spent more than a decade in custody with ample access to Western culture and entertainment. He is well fed and treated to the best health care available. And he has had plenty of time to think about his actions in 2002. So what is Omar Khadr like today? Joining me now is a man who may have that answer. Dr. Michael Wellner is a forensic psychiatrist with an organization known as the Forensic Panel. He has testified in numerous high-profile civil and criminal cases in the U.S., and he was a key witness for the prosecution at Khadr's military trial. Dr. Wellner, first of all, I thank you for joining me. I want to get right to it. You were hired by the Pentagon and asked to perform a psychiatric analysis of Omar Khadr. In addition to the 8 hours that you spent with Khadr, you spent hundreds of hours talking to other people who had also come in contact with him. You can tell us a little more about that. One of the main things, though, that you were tasked with and that we want to know from you today is Omar Khadr dangerous? But first, I want to start at the beginning. What were your first impressions when you first met Omar Khadr?
Well, I was surprised at how accessible he was. When you go down to Guantanamo and you figure that you're dealing with someone who was taken custody in the Afghan theater, you're assuming that you're going to go into an interview with someone where there's a cultural divide between you. And I was impressed by how easily he bonded with me. He is very socially comfortable. He's very socially agile. And he has an air and an awareness of his own importance. And he also knows how to manage an interview, even an interview with a trained professional. He knows what to say. He knows how to say it. He was adamant about his having been victimized by everyone around him, and very deftly distanced himself from discussion about what he was implicated in, his father's terrorist activities, and it took the interview device of sitting with him with a videotape of his bomb-making activities, having him watch it, and forcing him to sit with the issue to take him off script. And when one took him off script, he became peevish and impatient and annoyed, and again flipped it over to the interviewer. You're victimizing me. This is about this process, and this is why one does, as I did in my case, videotape the interview to demonstrate to the court and to his own attorneys that he was treated with every fairness. And one of the reasons why the defense fought so tenaciously to never show that videotape in court, because then people would see the real Omar Khadr as an adult.
Let's talk about the real Omar Khadr, and as you just said, the adult, because he has been held up as the poster child of being a child soldier. We don't need to get into, we've already gotten into the criteria that it takes, and that he doesn't necessarily meet that criteria. What I want to know from you, though, as far as him having been a child soldier, would you characterize Omar Khadr as this young, naive rube that many in the mainstream media and activists hold him up to be, or do you think he is entirely something different? I mean, did Omar Khadr even show any signs of post-traumatic stress disorder, which a lot of child soldiers show?
Well, that's a complicated question that you're asking, and it requires a complicated answer, because that was one of the issues that the Pentagon had brought to my attention, is just what was his level of maturity. And what many of us in Canada and the United States don't realize is that a 16-year-old who's been in Canada and Pakistan and Afghanistan and traveling around with his father, essentially at his father's side, for his father carrying out the leadership activities of a terrorist organization, is going to be more mature and more sophisticated and more worldly, and so he was. Now, that doesn't mean that when he got involved in the house from which the attack that killed the American soldier took place, that he was a hardened battle veteran, but that's not the point. What I ultimately ended up focusing on was, at the point in time when that fatal encounter occurred, was this something that he chose to take part in, or was he swept up in an activity in which, sure, he was making bombs and he was involved, but he never anticipated it really getting to this degree? And what was so instrumental in a successful prosecution effort was clearly detailing and demonstrating through available witnesses that, no, this wasn't an issue of a fog of war. This was a deliberate encounter that took place and unfolded over a period of well over an hour, and he had many opportunities for opt-outs, and that he was making conscious decisions when he made an aggressive and indeed an effort to kill an American soldier, and did.
I want to ask you about his sense of entitlement. You say there's this air about him, this sense of entitlement. How much of that is the fact that he was the favored son amongst the Khadr family, and how much of it is this pedestal that the mainstream media seem to have put him on, and how much of it is this treatment that he receives at Gitmo? Because as much as some people would like to say, oh, he's rotting away at Gitmo, he's anything but. He gets the best medical care. He gets a special diet prepared for him. He has access to books and DVDs, whatever. I mean, he's treated fairly well. So how much of his sense of entitlement comes from any one or all of those three things?
This is a complex question, and as are many with Omar Khadr. To some degree, he came into this experience with a certain position and certain air. He was the son of a leader within Al-Qaeda. He was someone who met bin Laden, and when you have that brush with bin Laden with as much esteem as he has, that stardust sprinkles down to someone, especially among other people who are fighters who only dream of someone that they hear about romanticized, as bin Laden was and probably still is. The media's role in this is that by creating and buying into the myth, and it is a falsity that he was tortured. In fact, that's another story in and of itself. But by turning him into some sort of cause celeb and victim, and coming to Guantanamo Bay with a special interest in him, he became all the more important, because when one of the prisoners attracts a lot of attention, what follows? Donations, volunteers, free legal help, pressure from other organizations, pressure from governments, and the way the other prisoners figure, hey, if all of this attention is coming to Omar, if one of these folks gets bored and looks for somebody else to help, maybe they'll come to me. And so it gives the prisoners a reason to curry favor, and it gives him a lot of social leverage. So the press enabled him to become even bigger than he was. And when I remembered asking one of the deputy commanders of Gitmo to ask about of his impressions about Khadr, he just said unhesitatingly, rock star.
I have to then bring it back to the first question. One of the things that you say about de-radicalizing people like Omar Khadr, Al-Qaeda people, is that they be westernized. He's been exposed to tons of Western culture. He's anything but westernized. If anything, you say he's been indoctrinated a second time. So the question is, can he be de-radicalized? How dangerous is the Omar Khadr that Canada will be getting back?
He was a jihadist who went into an environment, Gitmo, in which he just marinated in jihad. It is a natural environment in which folks are able to live the way they would in Afghanistan or Pakistan, and to socialize and to interact. And the corrections officers, the personnel, really give them that kind of distance to be comfortable, and it preserves a sense of safety and peace about Gitmo, and doesn't create and bring controversy. But at the same time, there's no countervailing force of moderation, of religion, that at all affects Guantanamo. And this is a problem not only in Guantanamo, but it's a problem in North American prisons, and it's had a lot of devastating effects in European prisons. Radical Islam is the dominant expression of Islam, possibly in the world, but most definitely in prisons. And if one is to be de-radicalized, it's not just about being westernized. Look, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed went to North Carolina A&T. All right? Osama bin Laden read poetry, and quite possibly when he was killed, he had an appetite for pornography. And so the idea of westernization isn't the issue. It's if someone acts violently in the name of theology, how are you going to change that? By teaching them about the New York Yankees? Well, obviously not. They have to rethink how they relate to their spirituality. That effort is not being done, either because the imams don't exist, or because the political will of the Islamic organizations is not to detoxify their religion and give voice to pluralistic Muslims. Until that happens, and until places like Gitmo are staffed with imams who will sit down with people and learn and work with their devout faith and teach them a pluralistic vision of coexistence rather than domination, then folks who come out of Gitmo are going to have fed off of the intensity and antagonism of their peers. Now, Omar Khadr, coming out of Gitmo, comes back to a family that's highly rejectionist, highly alienated, but based in Toronto in an infrastructure set up by a terrorist leader father that includes fundraising, networking, connection to cells all over the world, including people that Khadr met earlier in Guantanamo Bay.
Dr. Michael Wellner, you have so much more insight, and people can read about that in the book, Ezra's new book, The Enemy Within. We thank you very much for your time. That is Dr. Michael Wellner, forensic psychiatrist with the Forensic Panel. The clock is ticking on Omar Khadr's return to Canada, but is it a done deal, or is there a way out for the federal government? Omar Khadr cut a sweetheart of a deal at his military trial in 2010. Khadr accepted an 8-year sentence, allowing him to apply for transfer to Canada after serving just 1 year. Although little is known about the actual details of the arrangement, it's assumed our federal government signed off on it. But does that mean we are bound by the plea agreement? Ezra Levant joins me once again. So tell me about why this deal was struck. I mean, for all intents and purposes, the good guys were winning, so to speak, but then one of the things that it said in your book is something along the lines of it's like you're running it towards the end zone for the touchdown, and your own coach runs out and tackles you. The Obama administration stepped in and cut this deal.
Oh, it was amazing. I mean, the case was a slam dunk. As you know, the jury found a 40-year sentence. I mean, you had videotape of Omar Khadr building IEDs. You had his confession. It was a slam dunk. So why? Why would Obama let him go when he could get a real notch in his belt for cracking down on terror? Well, remember, Obama campaigned in the election in 2008 against the war on terror, against Guantanamo Bay. He said he would close it right away. He found this whole subject a rather prickly matter, and so he wanted just to make the problem go away. He sent home most of the inmates from Guantanamo Bay to their home countries, where about half of them committed terrorism again, by the way. Now, remember, on our Canadian side of the border, Stephen Harper had fought against the return of Omar Khadr, going all the way to the Supreme Court to avoid being compelled to bring him back. So Stephen Harper was doing the right thing. But President Obama made the request. And when the President of the United States asked Canada for a favor, well, you better have a good reason to say no. So under some sort of political duress, we sent what's called a diplomatic note saying we would look favorably upon a prison transfer. Well, Omar Khadr, it was his lucky day. I mean, the idea of coming home to Canada after just 1 more year, walking our streets within months after that, so they snapped at it right away. I'm afraid that's the pickle we're in now. How can we get out of that political promise to President Obama?
I mean, can we get out of it, though? Because it's one thing to send a diplomatic note and say we look favorably upon it.
Right.
We both know, though, that typically means, all right, fine, we're signing off
Right.
on it. But, I mean, there are some ways that we can get out of this. We can get, you know, some of it is for Public Safety Minister Vic Taves. There are some ways that he can possibly get us out of it. There's also the National Parole Board.
Right.
Let's start with Public Safety Minister Vic Taves and the options open to his office. Because the way he comes back, the official channel, is through the international transfer of offenders.
Exactly. We have a law that governs Canadian citizens who are arrested, tried and convicted in foreign countries. They'll let them serve their sentence back here at home. Typically, it's, say, a tourist gets in trouble for buying drugs in Thailand or something, and we let them come home and serve the sentence here because maybe the justice system wasn't fair, maybe the prisons are awful. That's typically what it's used for. It's very rarely used for Americans. But here's the thing about the International Transfer of Offenders Act. It requires the public safety minister, not the foreign minister, not the prime minister, the public safety minister to answer some tough questions like, is this person a danger to society? And so even though Lawrence Cannon, the former foreign minister, promised Hillary Clinton, yeah, we'll take him, well, it's Vic Taves who has to sign on the dotted line. And by law, he's got to look to public safety. There's nothing in the International Transfer of Offenders Act that says, will you be doing the U.S. president a favor? Check. It's, will you be protecting Canadians? And here's the crazy part, Jackie. As Dr. Wellner, who spent 2 days with Omar Khadr, knows, this man is highly dangerous, highly likely to reoffend. But the videotape of his discussion, the transcript of it, was not shown to the Canadian government before they were asked to take Khadr.
Okay, so can that even be a loophole that the Canadian government can say, you
Yes.
didn't show us that. We knew of Wellner's testimony, but we didn't see that tape, and had we seen that tape, we would not have agreed to this.
Exactly. So first of all, we don't need a loophole. We just have to follow the International Transfer of Offenders Act. But for political reasons, it's our way out. I mean, we don't need a way. We just have to follow the law. But that's the problem. How do you get out of a promise? Well, number one, they sold us a pig and a poke. They said, oh, no problem, just take this guy. But they withheld the dangerous info. Second of all, now that we know those tapes exist, Vic Taves ought to look at them before he can answer the law carefully. So until we see those videotapes, Vic Taves can't even do his job. And finally, God forbid, he's allowed back into Canada, he'll appear before the parole board. And you know our parole board, Jackie, it's like a revolving door. Like it puts people out on the streets way too early. Well, they have to assess safety also. How can they do their job if they don't see this videotape of a 2-day interrogation between Dr. Michael Wellner, one of the top forensic psychiatrists in the world, really, and Omar Khadr? Like, that is incredibly relevant material that the U.S. government has refused to release. I know why they refuse to release it. Because if people see the true character of Omar Khadr, we'll never accept him in Canada. So they tried to pull a fast one on us. And I think Vic Taves should obey the law, nothing more. He should not be political, the opposite. He should just be concerned about public safety, Jackie.
What is, or who is Omar Khadr today? We spoke to Dr. Wellner. You certainly have your feelings on it as well. You know, I may have mine. Dr. Wellner doesn't think he can be de-radicalized, if for no other reason than he's made no attempts to accept any help in being de-radicalized. Who is this Omar Khadr? Yeah. Let's say Vic Taves doesn't turn it down. Let's say this deal goes through. Yeah. Who is the Omar Khadr that we're getting back?
Well, he's a lot more sophisticated and grown up and dangerous today than he was when he was just shy of 16 years old. First of all, as I say, he's been soaking in terrorist marinade for 10 years. Like, he has been hanging out with fellow terrorists for 10 years. He is far more fanatical in his religiosity than he was 10 years ago. And his family has turned him into an al-Qaeda hero. So all of that portends poorly. But he now knows that he's a big deal. Like, he was a nobody 10 years ago. He's a big deal now. And with Osama bin Laden gone, here you have someone with a tie to bin Laden, whose dad was a confidant of bin Laden. Here you've got Omar Khadr, smart, multilingual, highly trained. He's got a notch on his belt for killing a U.S. soldier. Imagine him strutting his stuff on the streets of Canada, cock of the walk. It's a propaganda message. I killed an American soldier. I'm proud al-Qaeda. I've never renounced it. I'm walking free. You can too. We're winning this thing. And it's a moral victory for al-Qaeda. Even if he never kills again, he'll do the mosque circuit just like his papa. He'll be a celebrity even more. Oh, Michelle Shepard can hardly wait to have a sit-down interview with him. The CBC will make him a regular pundit. I wouldn't be surprised if he gets an honorary degree from a university. Maybe, I don't know, he'll run as a candidate for the NDP or something. The sky's the limit. He'll become a millionaire instantly from all the speeches and book deals, even if he doesn't even win his lawsuit against the Canadian government, which he might well, because the courts and the lawyers are so sympathetic to Khadr. His being on the streets, he is very sophisticated. We like to think that terrorists are dumb peasants. Remember who he comes from. Very intelligent father, sophisticated son, 10 years of planning in prison.
What can we do? Myself, people watching today, you know, is it call Public Safety Minister Vic Taves? Is it call the PMO? We're going to put up some contact information. But I mean, as you say, we can look at it and say, okay, you didn't show us the tape, we needed to see all that. Right. But how much will it help to have pressure from everyday Canadians to say we won't feel safe?
Very important, because this deal was done secretly. No one in Canada, no one in the media, no one in America publicly knew that this deal was being done. This was a private deal. We haven't even seen the full diplomatic note. And so what we have to do is expose it to the light of day. And ordinary Canadians, especially conservatives who supported Vic Taves, and the Prime Minister have to say, whoa, whoa, whoa. We thought you were against terrorists and for troops. We thought you were for America. We thought you believed in truth in sentencing. It flies against everything the Conservatives promised. So everybody has got to email Vic Taves and help him do the right thing. Jackie, I know Vic Taves a bit. I think he wants to do the right thing. We've got to make sure the Prime Minister allows him to do the right thing. And they've got to say, President Obama, we respect you, we love America, but we will not take your murderer and put him on our streets.
Ezra, it's been a fun hour. I wish I had a whole other hour with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jackie.
Ezra Levant. Well, there have been far too many articles, columns, and television and radio stories dedicated to Omar Khadr over the years, especially when you consider how little attention has been paid to the real victims in this tragedy. Their story next. The consensus media has made up their minds. Omar Khadr is a victim. That's why they always show his junior high yearbook photo, the one provided by his mother. And they never show that Al-Qaeda video of him building IEDs. But Omar Khadr isn't the victim here. Lane Morris was blinded by Khadr. He's a victim. Christopher Spear, the U.S. Army medic Khadr murdered, he's a victim. Tabitha Spear, his widow, a victim. And Spear's two young kids are victims. His little girl, who still talks about her daddy constantly. The son, who never knew him, but asks his mommy if daddy will grab his hand if he reaches high enough to heaven. They're the victims, no matter what the mainstream media says. I want to thank my special guest, Dr. Michael Wellner, for joining me this evening. I also want to thank senior producer Jeff Collier and editor Tina Bune for their tireless efforts on this special edition of The Source, as well as Megan McSween and Ricky Ratliff. And I especially want to thank the incomparable and unflappable Ezra Levant. The Enemy Within, Terror Lies, and the Whitewashing of Omar Khadr is available in stores now. I'm Jacqui Delaney. Thank you for joining me.